but what does that mean? And so the process is completely, ongoing. We'll get to women's suffrage. It's largely complete in the United States. There's no, there is suppression of voting, but it's not on the basis of gender anymore in the United States. It's mostly on the basis of political affiliation. So the women, now we'll get to women's suffrage next. On the abolition here, a master narrative, what you try to do is you start and you ask people basically what they know. So say you were going to give a talk on abolition, I don't know, to your grandchildren or something. They don't know anything. It is a little frightening. Really is. It's not just saying this as an old guy, but kids don't read books. Literally don't read books in high school anymore.
That's because they're taking them away.
Everything is on, well, it's a financial thing. You give them your Chromebook and you have it for the year. And they do read, but it's a different kind of reading entirely. And they don't write an essay. Except for, they still have to do this on an AP exam. They have to write an essay. I don't even know if they take those online anymore. But everything is online here. So the kind of reading that we're used to doing, which with an actual book, or we were used to doing, you do a line and then what did it say? And you look back at the line, you can go over stuff, you can go back. They don't do that. It isn't done. So the way they're processing information is different. It's just different, than the way we do it. So I look at high school kids and, so I bring this up because in case you're talking to your grandchild or something like that, who would you say are major figures, just in your own mind? There's like no wrong answers here, on the abolition movement in the United States, right? Which does officially end in December of 1865. When December 5th of 1865, the 13th Amendment is passed, right? And so there is no longer slavery, right? That's all it does. It doesn't grant any rights to the former slaves, but there's no longer legal slavery in the United States, right? The process of abolition in the United States, I would say, begins. There's these periods, you might have heard of them, the Great Awakenings. There was two of them, one in the 1740s and one in the 1820s and 30s, right? And these are movements to improve the moral character of the country, right? The first one, the first Great Awakening in the 1740s, there was a belief that Americans who were in Europe and had been in much tighter communities, they come to America and they're very far spread out, and so most Americans are unchurched. They don't go to church, right? All the people out in the farms and in the mountains and everything like this. And so you have itinerant preachers, going from place to place, and that there is a tradition of that. But the first Great Awakening here, and during this first Great Awakening, you have for the first time the Quakers leading the beginning of an abolition movement, right? And their motivation is pretty pure. This is this is wrong. It's like morally wrong, right? And it's a violation of, and they only argue from one religion, Christianity. It's a violation of Christianity. So this is where you would say the abolition movement, if you were looking at it in the United States, begins, right? And everybody's aware in 1619, the first slaves are brought to Jamestown. When you get into it, there's all this little granular stuff. They were not actually intended, like the guys who were taking Spanish, they were taking the slaves to the New World. They were intending to go to the Caribbean. They end up at Jamestown, and that wasn't like the original plan. And they say, here, you can have these guys. And the English settlers at Jamestown in 1607, their original intention was to enslave the native populations. That never worked anywhere in North America, right? The Indians would, Native Americans would either die or escape, head out somewhere to avoid that. So the slave labor was going to be produced by Africans. This has been going on for centuries before 1630, of course in South America, but in the Middle East, Africans had been enslaved by various, Islamic civilizations, that sort of thing. So it's a pretty common practice, right? What happens though, the difference, it kind of is, and the first, by the way, the first slaves that show up in Jamestown are treated as indentured servants, right? So the English, when they come to all their colonies, have a shortage of labor for whatever they're going to do. And so the solution is to have indentured servants, right? Where people come over, you pay for their passage, and then they pay you back over time. When they've sort of paid back their debt, then they become free into the community. This is a practice that went on into the late 1900s. My grandfather was an indentured servant. They came from what's now Slovakia in a glass factory in Pennsylvania that my wife and I visited 2 years ago, I think, in the summer. And my grandmother, who didn't come over with him, it was his second wife, my grandmother was an indentured servant at Goulden's Mustard Factory in Brooklyn. So, they paid their passage, and it came over, and it was interesting. Particularly with the second industrial revolution after the Civil War, there's a shortage of labor for this, and so you have all these agents going out from all these factories, recruiting, actively paying for people to come over and, assessing them. And everybody knows what the deal is, right? But quickly a judgment was made that the Africans who came, not speaking English, must be intellectually subhuman or something, and it's converted to slavery. They can't speak English. It's just kind of a weird sort of judgment thing. So, major figures in the abolition movement. Give me one. Anyone?
Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass. Okay. Without a doubt, and probably the most dominant figure. He's just sort of extraordinary, and even more so because obviously he's born a slave and that sort of thing. There is, we have here in Brockton something called the Frederick Douglass Association. You might be aware of. Next April 8th or something, a Tuesday, we're going to go to the library and we're going to discuss the narrative life of Frederick Douglass. Now, the first version, I don't know where I got this from. It was a school edition or something. It doesn't even have any publishing information. I don't know where I got it. I mean, I got it at school some year back. But the first version is this. It's not very fat. You can get a hold of it. He does do two more. This one is, 1846. He does another one in 1854, and he does another one after the Civil War, right? And they have different titles, but he does 3 autobiographies, right? And expands them as he gets older, right? So this one here is after he has escaped from slavery, comes to the boat, lives in New Bedford and all this sort of thing, is in Massachusetts. And he's recruited by the existing abolitionist movement to be a speaker, right? And he's just, and people don't believe he's a slave. He's self-taught reading. Well, no, it's not entirely. He was learned to read by the wife of sympathetic somebody, and he did lead to read. And then up in the north, he's a quick learner. And some people are just more astounding than other people are. It just is that way. And so this is like an incredible figure. So you can go deeper and deeper into this. But this is the first one. You can get it, as I say, and it's just revelatory. And this particular version is not like tiny writing, so I'm just recommending you get that. So you have Frederick Douglass here. It's funny, yet the last one. The last Frederick Douglass Association meeting we had it on Valentine's Day, and I think it was on Valentine's. It was right there, and that's it listed as his birthday, but he doesn't know when he was born, so he have to pick a birthday. Like you can't do anything official unless you can put down a birthday. So he picks February 14th, and the story is that his mother, who he was separated from when he was a little kid that he could remember, she called him my little Valentine. So anyway, that's where he gets that. He dies, this I should know, 1892, I believe, in Washington, D.C., right? And he has just sort of this amazing life. I should mention this, I guess, at a point. I have another book here for a recommendation. Big time recommendation here. So Frederick Douglass, you can read biographies of Frederick Douglass, right? If you really want the definitive one, it's a guy, David Blight, B-L-I-G-H-T, like the potato famine, Blight, He has a book, Frederick Douglass, it won the Pulitzer Prize 2019, I think. Frederick Douglass, I'm sorry.
Autobiography.
Yeah, it's a thing, but it's called Pioneer of Freedom? It's not Pioneer. Prophet of Freedom, thank you. Right, it's 912 pages. David Blight, his life is devoted to this. He teaches at Yale. I've met him a few times, and he's unlike, I go to history programs, and famous professors show up and talk to high school teachers. And there's always a little bit of, we teach at Princeton and you teach at, Brockton High or something. There's always a little bit of this. But Blight, I met him first time I ate lunch with him in Worcester, at Sturbridge Village at some history thing. And sat at a table, and he taught his first 7 years out of college. He's from Flint, Michigan. He taught at Flint North High School. He was an actual full-time high school history teacher for 7 years. So he knew what he was talking about when he talked to high school teachers. That's not the usual experience of college professors who usually go right through, out of undergrad, they go to grad school. Anyway, at a program I was at last summer in Gettysburg, he was giving a talk on something, and there was a question and answer, and I asked him about this book, right? So I'm going to write this on the board. And this has to do with Frederick Douglass. I'm not just making stuff up here. Frederick Douglass, it's called Transatlantic, and it's an Irish author, Colm McCann. Right. So, Transatlantic, Colm McCann, you can get it on, I've been getting most of my books. I got one due that I can pick up tomorrow at the library here. You can put them in if, it's like, if you buy a book now, what do you do with it kind of thing. Like you can't even give them away anymore. So, but get it, this thing. I am just, so it's a fiction, it's historical fiction, right? So it's about, and Colm McCann is about three Americans, three situations where people come from North America and go to Ireland. So it's an Irish story. The first ones are Alcock and Brown, the first guys to fly an airplane across the Atlantic. They fly from Newfoundland to Ireland. The second story, the middle story, is Frederick Douglass, right? And the last story is George Mitchell going to Belfast for the Good Friday Accords in 1998, and at least the fierce fighting part in Northern Ireland. So the middle part here is Frederick Douglass goes in 1846, and he spends 1846, 47, the beginning of 1848, he goes to Great Britain on the United Kingdom, right? Ireland is still completely ruled by the British at this time. And he goes there as a fundraiser. And I was reading in his, another story last night that he wrote about, he steps off the boat and in England he is free, right? And he's taken around as a fundraiser. Now, he's an exotic, right? A large, handsome, well-spoken black man in the United Kingdom. And so, you know, and he is a crowd pleaser wherever he goes. So at one point, he goes and spends a good deal of time in Ireland. Now, he's not with the Catholic Irish, he's with the, you know, Anglo-Irish, the Protestant leadership and stuff. They're taking him around, he's fundraising all over the place. Although he does, if you're familiar with Irish history, he does spend some time with, a personal time with Daniel O'Connell, the liberator. You know, if you know Dublin, there's the giant statue, you know, on the one side of the bridge. And of course, O'Connell is working for Irish Home Rule. But, so this book is kind of like, it's a true story, but it's a made up, you know, obviously he has to make up the dialogue and all of that. And it talks about, like, Frederick Douglass, you sort of get the fact, Frederick Douglass is a real person, not like Frederick Douglass as an iconic figure, you know. So you should read it, it's wonderful. The really stunning part comes. He's there at the beginning of the potato famine. And he is watching poverty and starvation, something that he never imagined. I mean, he didn't come from an impoverished, I mean, the slaves were impoverished, but he doesn't come from a poor society where there's any food shortages, and he's watching people dying. It's interesting, it's another place that I was looking at this, but the British were encouraging migration to the New World. They put the Irish on the, you know, the death ships, a lot of them, and just put them on there and get rid of them. I mean, they were happy for these people to leave, right? They want to settle Scots in there, and a lot of other English peasants who were hurt by the enclosure movement. So they'd like to move all the Protestants in, have all the dirty Catholics, you know, go away, right? And so this is taking place simultaneously. So this is just like, if you want to, you know, Frederick Douglass is a real person. This is a beautiful book. Okay. Okay, somebody else. Any?
Harriet Tubman.
What?
Harriet Tubman.
Harriet Tubman. Right. There was the, I can't remember the name of it now, the Harriet Tubman movie 2 years ago or something.
Yeah.
Cynthia Erivo, who was in Wicked, she played Harriet Tubman. And you know, this is just an extraordinary figure, right? The Moses of her people. She's part of the, you know, Underground Railroad, moving people out. But she, you know, she keeps on going back into dangerous territory and bringing people up out of slavery into the North, right? And it's not a bad idea to keep going. A lot of people are moving toward Canada, where they are accepted much better in Canada, right? There's never been slavery. The British Empire outlawed slavery in 1833. The British Navy has been trying to interdict slavery, slave trade. And, so Canada is a better place. It's for them. At one point, by the way, Frederick Douglass does go to Canada. After the John Brown attack on Harper's Ferry and this sort of thing, there were a lot of correspondence, and there was the investigators uncovered correspondence between Frederick Douglass and John Brown, and he was subject to arrest. This is happening right before the Civil War breaks out, but he lives in Rochester, New York, and he crosses in a ferry over to Canada to lay low for a little while, right? This is a period when there's slave hunters out there, and fugitive slave laws still in effect and that sort of thing. So Canada is a somewhat more welcoming place. I know if you go to Halifax, Nova Scotia, it's an odd sort of thing. The first time I went there was, I think, about 1975, and I was surprised at how many African American people there were in Halifax. And it turns out that during the American Revolution, the British were offering freedom to slaves who left the Americans and came over and joined their forces, right? And they were going to offer them things, but of course the British don't win that war. And now all these black people who came over and joined them, what are they going to do with them? So they resettled the blacks who had left, run away from the plantations to work for the British Army, not as soldiers. They were, digging ditches and building forts and stuff, but it was, important labor. They do move them up into Canada, maybe 20,000. But there is a very old, thriving community, African-American community in one part of Halifax. I saw a PBS show a couple years ago on this. So we have Harriet Tubman. Cool. Anybody else? Yeah.
I think we should highlight, if you were going into historical fiction, Little Women, because, the author of that, her parents are abolitionists and...
Right, Louise May Alcott, yeah. Just as another thing, actually, that book is wonderful for women's studies, obviously. One of the when I get to this, the women's suffrage isn't just about, the word suffrage refers to the voting, but it isn't just about that. There's a question of women's rights in general. Are they connected, right? So property rights and stuff. So in Little Women, they have their aunt who lives in the house over there that they don't visit, and she has no interest in being remarried, because if she did, at that time, pre-Civil War, her property, which was considerable, would revert to her husband. So she has no interest. I remember reading that and thinking, wow, this is a nice little piece. Now, women at the time, when it was written, would recognize this right away, but it's not automatically known by us now, where that's not an issue. But I was looking at this, and like women's property rights, I was looking at sort of the history of this, and it is until the 1970s that women can own a credit card separately, that they can make transactions without having their husband sign. I was just surprised this was in the 1970s. I was out of college, and I was sort of unaware of that. I never was aware that my mother took care of all the finances at our house, but I didn't know that she'd have to have things co-signed and stuff by my dad in the 50s and 60s. So this is kind of unalterable, inextricable. Women's rights aren't just voting. There are other sorts of things. Divorce rights, all this kind of stuff wasn't automatic, and it comes along with sort of a women's liberation movement. A few more on It's a funny thing. These days, there's a clock over there. These days, you can't be guaranteed that there's going to be a clock in your classroom, in a school classroom. So because I started teaching before like any digital anything, I still look up. And it's so easy to sort of time yourself as you're going along by looking up, and everybody else look. In fact, they don't even have watches, right? You pull out your thing, and then you got to put the little numbers, and you can see what time it is. Anyway, I was just checking on the time there. Sorry about that. Another person though.
Was one of the Adams, John,
Oh, yeah, what? That's a good one, yeah. So you could put John Quincy Adams in there. Do you know, have you ever seen the movie Amistad? If you haven't, I don't know, get a hold of it. Amistad. It's gotta be at least 15, 20 years maybe old, right? And, Silence of the Lambs, what's that guy's name? Anthony Hopkins plays John Quincy Adams. Matthew McConaughey in an early role, very good movie. John Quincy Adams actually really isn't involved in the abolitionist movement directly, but that incident. So what happens is, I think that's 1833. I'm not sure exactly the day. There's a Spanish ship that's taking slaves to the Caribbean, and they have to avoid the British Navy is trying to interdict slavery. But no Americans are doing this because it's such a hot issue. So there's a sort of a slave revolt on a ship, and they take over the ship. But the newly enslaved slaves from Africa don't know how to, steer a ship. There's big sailing ships, highly skilled things. So they keep a couple of the Spanish guys alive, and the Spanish guys don't exactly, and they end up in Connecticut, accidentally, right? Now they've landed in a state by that time which has freed all their slaves. And so are they free or not, right? The people who have, on paper, own the slaves petition in court, to have them returned. And John Quincy Adams just says, nah, I'm not doing that. He and Carter are the greatest ex-presidents, right? John Quincy Adams doesn't go home and retire or, to his house in the Cape or anything like that. He runs for Congress and is a long-time congressman from that district around Quincy. And so he just sees this as simple injustice, right? Now, he's also been, he's against slavery, I guess, but he's not actively involved in freeing the slaves, except for this big incident. Also in Congress, he fights against something called the gag rule. 1836, after the Texas independence, Texas applies for, when they get free from Mexico, they apply for membership in the Union as a state with a slavery in their state constitution, and the northern people blocked this for years and years and years until 1845. But they pass a law in Congress called the gag rule that you can't talk about slavery. And Quincy Adams is also pissed about this, and he's always reading letters from his constituents, and they're gaveling him down. So he's quite an extraordinary figure there. So I recommend that. Amistad, right? And if you go to New Haven, there's a Amistad statue there commemorating the event. Where else we go? Yeah.
I don't remember his name, but he was an abolitionist. He had an abolitionist newspaper in Boston.
Oh, yeah. Okay. glad somebody got that. This guy's my personal favorite. Right. One of the questions is, so black people are now free, let's say, are they your equal? This is a real impediment to the white people, right? Lincoln, for example, doesn't really believe this, right? There are relatively few. Not Garrison. Garrison's personal background is from up by Rockport, like Rockport, Marble Hill.
Beverly Peabody Museum.
Yeah, he was abandoned by his father first, and then his mother left the kids and stuff. So at 14 years old, he is on his own. He moves to Boston, apprentices out to a printer, learns how to be a printer, and because of his poverty, he lives in a black community. He goes to black church, where at times he's the only white guy in church. And so this is like a no question issue for William Lloyd Garrison. This isn't like, oh, what do I really believe thing. So anyway, Garrison, 1831, the first issue of the Liberator, right? I mean, this guy, it's a two-person operation, right? There's one guy sort of managing the office, selling the subscriptions to his newspaper, and Garrison himself sets the print, right? Starts out with he eventually gets 3,000 subscriptions, which doesn't sound much, but with the people paying for his newspaper, right? On the first page, and if you see, like you can search it, there's a black person in bondage up at the top, but on the first page, he says his intention is to end slavery, just this one guy. And on the first page it says, I am in earnest and I will be heard, right? And so Garrison publishes this weekly until December of 1865, when the 13th Amendment, and that's the end of this. So these things go, right? In the spring of 1975, I was going for an oral comprehensive exam. This is at BC for a Master's in American History. And in the oral comprehensive, like all your teachers, they pick 3 of them, and you sit there and they can ask you anything, right? So the first question, I will never forget this. The first question that they ask is, why is 1831 an important year in American history, right? It's not just the first edition of The Liberator, but it's also Nat Turner's revolt. Right? Now, I didn't know if you know, and these are like in my notes somewhere, if you know about this. In 2016, there was a movie out. It was out in the summer. I mean, I saw it, but I don't know, there was a big seller. It was called Birth of a Nation. It was made by, I don't know the name of the black director, and it was about Nat Turner's. You can find this on Amazon or whatever, but it's around, it was called Birth of a Nation. And it's an ironical title because Birth of the Nation was E.W. Griffin's movie, right, that showed the basic story in Griffin's thing was that after the Civil War, the white people take back the South and they defeat the Yankees' plans to transform their society, you know, that sort of thing. And of course, famously, Woodrow Wilson. I just finished reading a book about Woodrow Wilson, new thing that came out. I've always hated Woodrow Wilson since I was in college. Woodrow Wilson, of course, famously shows it in the White House. Woodrow Wilson is a valid racist, no doubt about it. I mean, just bad. One of the things that the Republicans, he was Democrat, and this is Democrat, the whole party from Andrew Jackson, Jeff Davis, these are all Democrats kind of thing, and he's one of them from the South. He's from the South, grew up in Virginia and Georgia. When he was a little boy, he saw the Union troops come in, burning the stuff and everything, and he is not for this stuff. He's also, when I get to it, a major stumbling block to women's suffrage in the United States. Just like a totally bad guy, right? Anyway, but when you learn about Woodrow Wilson at all in schools, everything is dash points. And so he was part of the progressive movement. The fact that we have a Federal Reserve System, right? We had a central bank under Alexander Hamilton, killed by Andrew Jackson. I will kill the bank, and he does. And then we don't have a central banking system, which a modern country would have to need, until Woodrow Wilson in 1916. So we have the Federal Reserve. But there's the Federal Trade Commission and this sort of thing. And then usually they say, well, Wilson was president. We had women's suffrage, right? That took place while Wilson was president. At the very end of his presidency, August of 1920, and then in 1920 there's election for somebody else, Warren Harding, after him. But anyway, he's usually put in there, and so he's sort of thought of a progressive good guy if you don't know any details. Nat Turner, right, in Southampton, Virginia, I don't know where that is, it's somewhere down near the North Carolina border, very rural place. There is an uprising led by a guy named Nat Turner, who was religiously oriented. He was a sort of a lay preacher in the black community. He leads this revolt, right? And so in many places, the black people outnumber, in the rural areas, outnumber the white people, right? Just so, why don't we just go attack them and kill them all? So they do kill, estimates are between 55 and 65 white people going from plantation to plantation, trying to lead a larger revolt. But, they're hampered by just simply lack of information. Even Nat Turner. No one's ever been anywhere, right? I mean, they've never been to Richmond, which might be 60 miles away. They've never been anywhere. This quickly collapses. Within a week, the Virginia militia, whatever, puts down the revolt, and they don't catch Turner for 3 months or something like that. And of course, he's publicly killed and all this sort of thing. What happens, though, in 1831 is there's a turn with these two things. There's a turn in attitude, right? Garrison really has an effect on his stories about what slavery really like. People are reading this, people have, it's like when you look at Harriet Beecher Stowe's big fat Uncle Tom's Cabin, you think, my gosh. But people don't have any other, that's their, at night you read a book. And most of it, by this time, the United States is very big on literacy, even by this time. So it's pretty widespread with free public school systems and this sort of thing for white kids. But anyway, so people are reading this kind of thing. And then this happens. The word's fear, by the way, and it was kind of, when you read in a lot of places, slavery in the South before the Nat Turner was kind of sloppy. If you were in South Carolina somewhere, you might send some of your slaves into Charleston, and they would do a little work, and then they'd get a little bit of cash on the side, but mostly you would get the money for it. And there was a lot of movement, right? But after this, there is just fearsome crackdown, like laws circumscribing the movement of blacks, and if there's any kind of talk back, there's a fearsome punishment, right? And extraordinary thing to think about, the status of black people. This is called like chattel slavery, chattel property. The black slave had the same legal status as the cows and pigs and chickens and the dogs. Literally, this is in court cases. And of course, finally, with Dred Scott in 1857, the Supreme Court clarifies this status. So these are owned beings, right? So to a certain degree, that governs how well you take care of your cattle, chickens, and pigs and stuff like this, your dog or whatever. So you have the whipping, not so much killing, because you still got to send the person out into the fields the next day. I just, like I've read really deeply on this, and on the one hand you go, oh, how can that be? How can humans be that way? But you can turn on the television any day and look at Gaza. And you can look at Gaza and you say, I mean, just extraordinary, vicious, purposeful cruelties done every day by human beings. So, you know, it's not so great if you look at, I mean, you can get pretty depressed if you look at how human beings really are. So anyway, keep that at that. One of the things that's notable is that in the period after the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan going around and lynchings and all this sort of thing. Once they're not property anymore, the you know, like, don't damage your cow kind of philosophy is gone, right? And so that the killings have no economic drawback. Stuff is like really nuts. But anyway, here it is. Now, starting with this, the Southerners, right away, of course, it's like today's disinformation. They're saying that Garrison caused this. Of course, these people couldn't read, and it's at the same time. So Garrison's papers is going to say, so that doesn't, but you know, as the years go on, the myth is that Garrison's doing this. Garrison is the guy who employs Frederick Douglass the first time. The same. Douglass's first sort of public speech is in Nantucket, which was a hotbed of abolition at the time. And, you know, he's brought around and stuff. But in a few years, he feels constrained by Garrison. Feels like he's sort of like Garrison's pet, you know, coming around. Let me display my pet tiger or whatever like this. And so he does want to break away. And so this trip to Great Britain is a state for independence. He has a lot of money when he comes back. Not only that, but during his trip to Ireland, his freedom is bought by British. They send money to Thomas Auld, who is his owner in Maryland. Auld says this isn't enough, and they send back a note to Auld saying, take it or leave it. And there's a story that Garrison and Auld met later on in life when Auld was dying or something like this. I don't know. Garrison never knew who his father was, so it's kind of questionable there. I mean, excuse me, Douglas didn't know who his father was. So Garrison and Douglas have a long time kind of bad relationship, and it's kind of sad. Now, Garrison was like, he's kind of prickly, and he was like, I'll tell you what I believe about anything, and sometimes he didn't rub people the right way and this sort of thing, right? One of the differences is, I don't know if any of you have ever gone to Rochester, New York. I went on a history program there, Rochester's Reform Trail, and it was a hotbed of all sorts of reform movements. This is starting with the Second Great Awakening in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. When Douglas comes back from Britain, he moves to Rochester, right? And he starts his own abolitionist paper, the North Star, right? So he's got sort of a competing paper here, and he has, really good story wherever he goes. And so he's a little more popular. Garrison, though, is like, Garrison's like, he's going to end slavery. I mean, he is just really on this. So if you go to Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, it's big and famous in Rochester. Rochester, I spent a week there with this history program. It's actually a pretty cool place. It has big falls in it in the middle. They have beer places. They make a lot of beer in all these things. No, it has a river that goes right down through the middle of it, so it's beautiful. And they have the Museum of Toys there, which is quite good. There's a Kodak Museum and all this sort of thing. And also there is the center of the women's liberation movement. So Susan B. Anthony House is in Rochester. Elizabeth Cady Stanton lives just a little bit away. The Seneca Falls Museum of Women's History is there, where the first women's rights convention in the United States was in 1848. Interestingly, and I chose not to go to this, I wanted to go swimming in the lake, so I didn't go out to this thing, but nearby there is the Hill Cumorah, which is where Joseph Smith was given the Mormon tablets by the angel Moroni. And so it's really, it was called the burnt over district. John Brown, I forgot to put here, right, John Brown, lived in this area, right? And so it's John Brown and his people that lead the first sort of attempts to free slaves in Kansas, right, during Bleeding Kansas, right? And then John Brown, of course, launches the attack on Harper's Ferry, which was in Virginia then, now is in West Virginia. You can go visit that as a historical site. It's pretty cool. You have to park away from here and they take you in by buses, and it's overlooking the Potomac River up in, the kind of Western Maryland, West Virginia place. But anyway, so John Brown's attempt there was to try to lead a slave revolt. Didn't particularly happen. He's caught, but he becomes a folk hero, right? His trial was interesting because he defends his point of view and points out, and of course the Union Army goes into battle singing John Brown's body is molting in the grave, if you ever hear it. So Union soldiers would go in singing the song, John Brown's Body. And so he's a big, important figure. So Douglas, if you go to the Mount Hope Cemetery, he's buried near Susan B. Anthony. He has a giant stone, gravestone, and then right next to it is a kind of a monument to him, so he's really large. William Lloyd Garrison, my wife and I went to 2 years ago or something to find his grave. It's in Forest Hills, up near the new stadium that they're building, the White Stadium thing. It's up there. There's no signs, follow this arrow to Garrison's place. You hook up, it's the end. You have to find it yourself. Actually, you can go online, to places and you can find out where it is. And it's him and his wife, 2 little things. No line, no nothing. There he is. Anyway, so, and I guess the last one I do want to mention. Right. Uncle Tom's Cabin. Right. Very famously, Abraham Lincoln had her to the White House, and the quote is, "So you're the little lady that started this big war." I have to say I was 47 years old before I read the book, which you knew about, well, you know, your whole life if you were a history teacher. But I was taking a summer school course on the coming of the Civil War in Harvard that year, in 1997, 1995, and I finally read this thing, right? And I thought, well, it has kind of archaic language, you know, the way somebody might write in the 1850s, but it is just extraordinary for its power and personalizing the experience of the people in slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe, when she wrote it, lived in Maine, and but she grew up in Cincinnati, where her father ran a big, famous theological seminary. And story is that once she and her sister crossed over into Kentucky. Kentucky was the worst of the slave trade states. Right? They didn't employ that many slaves in agriculture, but they were a big slave trading place, right? Kentucky stayed in the Union, so the Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves in Kentucky. And so when the Constitutional Amendment finally passed in December of 1965, there were still 2 states. Delaware had 800 slaves legal, even though the Civil War had been over since April, and Juneteenth was in June, and Kentucky had 10,000 slaves still, right? So, and you know, the famous scene where little Eliza is crossing the Ohio River to start it out, right? And so she's going from Kentucky to Ohio for freedom, right? And so Harriet Beecher Stowe had seen a slave market in Kentucky, and then so she has a bunch of children. One of her sons dies, and she's like really depressed, and they move up to Maine. She does help right before she writes the book, it kind of, a runaway slave comes by, and she aids him. By the time this happens, the fugitive slave law has been passed, and aiding a fugitive slave is a crime, right? So, by the 1850s, once the West has been taken from the Mexicans, the native peoples, etc., and the United States is all there, the big question is, will slavery be legal in the new territories? The Civil War is about this, whether there'll be the extension of slavery into the new territories. The Civil War is not about freeing the slaves, right? Slavery is the chief cause of the Civil War, of course, but it's not fought specifically to do this. Somewhere I got on my notes here, in March of 1861, the Corwin Amendment passed with Lincoln's assent, saying that it was going to be a constitutional amendment saying that slavery could not be disrupted in any place where it currently existed. So this was a hope, a last desperate thing. It was passed on March 1st. Lincoln became the president on March 4th. Some of the states had already seceded from the Union, but it was a last desperate attempt to make it clear that this is not about ending slavery. It's about the extension of slavery. And if slavery can be extended out into the West, it's thought of as like agriculture. You got people picking cotton, but the slaves can work in mines or on wheat fields or whatever. And the Republican Party, which came into existence in 1854 in Michigan, their motto was free soil, free labor, free men. That they do not want black people being freed and then compete, or even as slaves, competing with them in all of these territories that are now boundless, opportunities out there. They don't want this, so this is what happens. The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, in 1862, is a pragmatic decision by Lincoln, right? They're not doing so well in the war, and one of the things, and it's an economic matter to, like, if you want to hamper the Southern Army, I mean, who makes the clothes for the Southern Army slaves? Who grows the food for the Southern Army slaves, right? So if you offer freedom to slaves, leave, or we're going to come and free you, or whatever like that, then this is a tremendous workforce, right? That's going to be, and hurts the Southern economy. So it's a big deal. Plus, they decide with the Emancipation Proclamation that black men can join the Union Army. So you have 180,000 black men join the Union Army during the course of the Civil War. Highly motivated, give them a gun, they're going to shoot one of these people. Highly motivated troops. I mean, and it starts with Robert Gould Shaw. There's a movie way back called Glory about that one, right? But of course, if you go up to the State House and you see St. Gaudens's sculpture, it's just really motivational. So anyway, you have that goes on. Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1862, says that Union troops come in if they go into places in rebellion. So there were 15 states that had slavery, 11 of them seceded. 4 of them, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, never went into rebellion, so slavery is legal in those places, right? Still, right, till the end. Although Missouri and Maryland actually passed laws before the 13th Amendment. But anyway, very close to it, right? So they're still legally. So you have like Sherman's March to the Sea, right? And you have all the slaves, coming behind the Union armies, right? The Union armies are burning the plantations and freeing the slaves, and the slaves are working for the Union Army now, either as soldiers or doing other things helpful to the Army. So, the Emancipation Proclamation is very, very helpful to the cause. And Lincoln is not winning this. It's a sort of another thing, Reconstruction, but Lincoln is killed within the same month as the war ends, and he is succeeded by Andrew Johnson, a senator, fierce racist. This is just stunning when you look at it, in retrospect. From Tennessee, from a slave state. Johnson hates black people. He's Lincoln's vice president, right? In the second term. Who was Lincoln's president in the first term, vice president in the first term? Here's a trivia question if you're in jeopardy. It was Hannibal Hamlin, who was the governor of Maine. That was the VP in the first one. Lincoln, you see Lincoln the God up in D.C. at the Lincoln Memorial, 1922 that was built, and you think, how could Lincoln? But when in the 1864 election, Lincoln thinks he may lose, and so he's trying to get white people who are racist to vote for him anyway. The white people want the Union, rejoined, but so he's appealing, honest to God, to white racists. See, I'm not that bad. I'm not really trying to make blacks here equal. I'm not denigrating Lincoln. Lincoln is, you read his stuff, is the most brilliant president that we've had. Just an extraordinary person. But he's balancing, he's balancing this. If he doesn't win the election in 1864, his opponent, George McClellan, is saying that he's going to come to terms with the South, right? He's going to come to terms with them and basically sign a ceasefire. And Lincoln's not going to have that after all the sacrifice by 1864. No, the election's in November of 1864, right? And Lincoln's not having that, so he makes this choice to pick this guy. Well, the problem is Lincoln dies, and then for almost it's 1 month short of the 4 years of that presidency, Johnson is blocking every single attempt at reform that is being passed by Republicans. The radical Republicans control the Congress, both houses, and he is vetoing everything and just fighting a rearguard action against creating decent conditions for the newly freed slaves. It's just extraordinary. And you think, what if Lincoln wasn't killed, all this sort of thing, It is an interesting thing. If you go to D.C., you can go as a tourist to Ford's Theater. You can go up into the booth where Lincoln was, right? I mean, where was his bodyguard? The story is he was out having a pop. Why was John Wilkes Booth so easily have access? Because he worked as an actor in the theater, and this sort of thing is like these accidents of history. But this was, for race relations in the United States, unrecoverable. That was the opportunity to make a statement about, and they do pass constitutional amendments, and Grant does follow Johnson. But the opportunities, to strike at the end of the war were just lost. 4 years is a long time not to do anything about this. And Grant comes in. Grant was a good guy. The old joke about who's buried in Grant's tomb. You know that joke? There's that old thing. And people go, who? I don't know. Anyway, I don't know if you've ever gone to Grant's tomb. It's in the northern part of the upper part of Manhattan, right near in Harlem, right near the Columbia. It's right across the street from the Columbia University, like the main Broadway or something like that. It's a great big thing, and it's a mausoleum, big like temple-like thing. And Grant is buried sort of down. It was modeled after Napoleon's tomb, and so it's similar to Napoleon's tomb in Paris, kind of thing. And, Grant was a really big figure that we don't think about much. Tried really, really hard on the, providing opportunities to the freed blacks. He was sunk by a fearsome depression. They used to call them panics. The Panic of 1873, severe downturn. And so the idea of spending more money, by this time people were sort of tired. The war ended 12 years earlier, or whatever, 8 years earlier. People in the North are tired of paying taxes for programs for the blacks and all this sort of thing. Didn't we do enough? 622,000 Americans killed in the Civil War by other Americans, right? 622,000. There were 31 million people in the country at that time. That's a pretty big percentage. And so there's a lot of people think, we've sort of done enough kind of thing. And of course with the downturn, like people don't have money, they don't feel to, and that pretty much ends it. And then you have just bad, 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 bad until starting in the 1950s. You have a little bit of a turnaround in the Supreme Court starting with Brown. So anyway, I do have interesting, just on that somewhere when you look at it. You might see two quotes that I have there by Thomas Jefferson. My favorite president is Franklin Roosevelt, but my second favorite president is Thomas Jefferson, right? For all his flaws. So, Declaration of Independence, if you've read it, I thought about doing readings of documents here sometime, just read it, what does it say? The Declaration of Independence, is this brilliant statement. When I used to teach European history, when I needed a single statement for the AP kids, what is the Enlightenment about? They took an American document, the Declaration of Independence, to explain the principles of the Enlightenment, right? So, your quality, your status as a full human being comes from God. Well, the Creator. Jefferson's a deist. He doesn't believe in an interventionist God. The watchmaker God. You know, like you wind it up and you send it out there. But it comes from God, right? This isn't given to you by government. Your rights are not bestowed upon you by government. The purpose of government is to protect the rights that come from your Creator. And the Enlightenment believed that the Creator gave human beings the capacity to solve their own problems. Right? That's essentially here. You don't have to depend on other people or your rulers, whatever. Everybody has the ability to solve their own problems. And then the Declaration, after the statement of principles there, sometimes I have to explain to people that's not a law, right? The Constitution's the law. The Declaration of Independence is Jefferson's statement about who we should be, right? This is who we should be, the goal. Anyway, but of course Jefferson has slaves. But after that, there are 27 complaints against George III, specifically. He did this, he did this. If you look at your, you can pull it up on your screen. And people don't look at that. But one of the ones, Jefferson wrote this stuff, but he had to have it voted on by the other people in Philadelphia. You know, you may have gone down to Independence Hall. And so they made him take out one of those things where he condemns the slave trade. And now Jefferson is condemning the slave trade, where I have it on this first page, and it's with three stars there, but I love saying this. He has waged cruel war, that's a he, is George III, against human nature itself, violating its most sacred principles of life and liberty in persons of a distant land, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. Jefferson is trying to end the slave trade. And then down at the bottom, the original Constitution, it's Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1. No law could be made before 1808 to end the slave trade. So it was like one of these compromises, like a 3/5 compromise. You know, for purposes of congressional representation, a slave counts as 3/5 of the man. You might have heard that phrase. And there's all these compromises. So a lot of people want to end the slave trade. But the slave trade is not a good thing. It's not a good thing for the white citizens. Bringing the slaves in, Jefferson knows this. This is not a good thing for the white citizens. Jefferson envisions a country of yeoman farmers. That is, a guy who owns your own farm, and you work on the farm with your family. Right? That's what he is. This is why he buys the Louisiana Purchase. He says, for 100 years, we have all this territory for the yeoman farmers, right? Individual farmers, you own your own place. He's not big on industrial revolution. His vision isn't that. This is the basis of his fights with Hamilton, who wants the country to be an industrialized country, right, so that it can be a great world power. Jefferson wants a place where you can go and live free from, and it seems this way with the big oceans, free from the world, right? And so having these black slaves is just degrading morally and financially. And then eventually he pushes. And so in January 1st, 1808, there's actual law passed. Well, the Congress passes a law implementing this statement in the Constitution, and Jefferson writes, "I congratulate you, fellow citizens, as you approve the opportunity to withdraw the United States from all further participation in these violations of human rights, which have so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa, in which the moral reputation and the best of our country have long been eager to prescribe." So Jefferson does have the slaves. He's not cruel, but he's pretty indifferent to his slaves by all accounts. He's not wonderful on this issue. Jefferson's asked about this. How can you hold these two different views? He says slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. You can't let go, but you can't hold on forever, right? And you might say, well, he's just being tricky there, but it really does sort of illustrate his ideas. Okay. Motivations for abolition. There are the people that say this is a moral issue. There's also the economic considerations of this. Slavery isn't a good thing. One thing I want to point out, here's a really old book, right? And I'm going to, I looked it up on Amazon. You might be able to get it from like Brockton Library, the Old Colony System. You can get books from, Pembroke or whatever like this, but it's called Tom. The Curse. Okay, it's 1974, so it's a really old book. I looked on it. This exact cover is available on Amazon. The Economics of American Negro Slavery. Like if you want to read something good. Anyway, the thing that was a breakthrough here is 1974. The argument had been for much of race relations in the United States, but particularly for slavery, that there's always that argument that the slaves are better off, right? They're in Africa, they were savages, now we bring them over here, and we make them Christians. They praise Jesus, and now they can go to heaven. And we're teaching them how to use tools. They didn't know how to, and all this sort of thing. These guys write this book and talk about how extraordinary what extraordinary contributions the black slaves made to the working of the whole systems here. And it's an argument against 74. That's a long time ago, but argument against this idea that these people are somehow raised by slavery, and in fact they're doing so. At the time, I read this in graduate school in the 70s, but at the time it was pillory back and forth. Oh, where's his statistics? But he came up with this new system of analysis called pleometrics. I'm not an economist, and I was very happy. He wrote this in 74, but in 1990, Vogel got the Nobel Peace Prize for economics for this particular analytical system. So, time on the cross if you're looking for something else. One last thing, and I'm going to go to women's slavery. There is available on PBS, you can buy this, pbs.org, a DVD of the abolitionists. I think it's a tiny little writing. I think it's 180 minutes. So it's a 3-hour thing. There's 3 episodes. It's very good on the abolition movement. It's just wonderful. Major characters, it covers Garrison Douglas, Angelina Grimke. I didn't talk about her at all. 2 Southern women who grew up in privilege on a Southern plantation in South Carolina, but come up to the North and are testifying throughout the North in abolitionist meetings about the actual cruelty that they've observed. Harriet Beecher Stowe and John Brown, right? So this is wonderful if you want to get it. It's called Just the Abolitionist, and you can get it on the PBS. I don't think it's anymore on PBS Passport. I don't think you can call it up for that, but you can order it through the pbs.org if you wanted to.